I think with the police, I think it's a very reactive or punitive approach when it comes to mental health rather than an actual health approach. I think people with mental health issues need first and foremost adequate treatment, and police need to be better trained to recognize symptoms of mental illness and also have the resources to refer the case to the appropriate mental health services. Um, I mean, at the moment, we don't really have a system that allows for ease of access to mental health services. I know you can call 911 very easily and the police will show up in a matter of minutes. Um, and as a result of that, police are often called upon as the first responders in situations involving mental health crises. But the thing is, the typical police responses to suspicious activity, like interrogation and detention, aren't necessarily appropriate in situations of mental health crises. And when police officers behave unsuitably in those situations, we have the people who suffer from mental illness. Um, they aren't necessarily able to respond in the way that police officers might want them to. And I think that creates a disconnect between the police and members of the community. And as a result, I think police need to not only be better trained to recognize symptoms of mental illness, but also um, we need to create a system in which we have mental health professionals dealing with mental health crises, not police. I think the very first thing we need to do is better training. Um, I think that we need to make, because police officers are often called upon to handle mental health crises, I think we need to make it mandatory to have police officers learn how to handle those situations, how to recognize symptoms of mental illness. And we also need to have a system in place, perhaps behind the scenes, that once police officers are called to a situation and they've recognized that it's a mental health crisis, they can notify a proper um, system that's occurring behind the scenes, proper perhaps mental health counselors that can come to the scene and aid in de-escalation. So I think training is the number one thing we need to do at the moment. I think so. Um, I think that kind of legislation really restricts the possible options a person has in a mental health crisis. And I think that when you are going through something like a crisis, you need immediate access to a hospital and um, you need an immediate option. Sometimes police aren't the best people to provide that. So I think we need to expand the legislation a little bit more to include um, members of the community or mental health professionals to sort of better open the options for a person going through a mental health crisis. I definitely feel like there needs to be a reallocation of funds. Like I've said, that the police are kind of juggling a lot of hats right now. They're acting as both police officers and de-escalation professionals and also mental health professionals. And I feel like once you start removing the mental health aspect from the role of police, you also need to take that money away and put it towards the people that you are hiring in place of police officers to deal with mental health crisis. Yeah, so I'm a part of my school's mock trial team, and for one of our competitions, we actually had our school resource officers come in and talk us through the Canadian legal system, talk us through the case we were handling, and provide support to us in that way. And I think that it really bettered my relationship with the school resource officers. I think it really um, overall bettered the overall perception I held for them. And I think in that regard, they sort of met their purpose in creating this relationship with youth in the school that um, that they had been assigned. It varies school to school, person to person. Um, I think that it's really important to listen to our community. And I think if members of our community are saying that sometimes they feel unsafe with the school resource officers or they feel targeted. I think it's not really up to me to belittle that experience because I've had a good experience. I think um, we need to really listen to people in marginalized communities. And I think we really need to take a step back and consult with these communities because ultimately our schools represent the people inside them. And if the people inside them don't feel safe, I think we need to um, talk to them in order to develop a better system, in order to better perhaps the current system we have, in order to ensure that the school resource officers meet their purpose in um, fostering a relationship between youth and authority. I think consultations with the community, I think you need to bring in students that represent a wide variety of groups, of ethnic groups, of age groups. I think you need to talk to a large sample of students. Because something I've noticed is that when we conduct studies um, revolving around school resource officers, we tend to um, hinder our sample size and that we only tend to talk to a certain group of students. But I think we need to really expand our reach and talk to a larger group of students in order to completely, thoroughly understand what is going on with the school resource officers and what the general community response to them is. I think we also need to consider that if we were to perhaps remove the SRO program, what we would put in place of them. I think the SRO program takes about $9 million annually, and that's a large investment that could be put towards getting more guidance counselors, and hiring more mental health professionals or just bettering the overall school mental health program. And I feel like that's a question we really need to answer. And in addition, I think that um, we also need to think about the fact that these students are not, these schools aren't really necessarily check boxes to fill. It's not about, oh, we need to hire an X number of more guidance counselors for each school. I think we really need to ensure that these guidance counselors speak to these students. I think the guidance counselors themselves should come from a variety of different ethnic groups to better relate to the students and to better the overall mental health capacity of the school. And I think that those are all questions we need to answer before we can really make a final decision on whether or not the SRO program should stay or leave. I think body cameras are a very small step in the larger scheme of reevaluating our systems of law enforcement. I think theoretically, body cameras um, do have potential, but I think it's also important to consider the fact that the police officers in Minneapolis that were involved in the George Floyd killing were wearing body cameras. And you know, I think that body cameras are only as effective as the system behind it. And so if we implement body cameras, we also need to take a step back and look at our overall police force. We need to take a deeper look at the issue of or our laws of qualified immunity. We need to take a deeper look at the way police officers are hired, the way they're trained, the type of training they receive. And I think that reformation shouldn't end at the implementation of body cameras. And I think that um, body cameras should only be a very small facet of a larger restructuring of the police force.
I think it's really important to remember and remind the public, especially the police force, that individuals who are suffering from mental health crises shouldn't be punished. These are people who are going through a crisis. These are people who are ill, and they need help. They don't need to be punished. They don't need violence. They don't need to be arrested, certainly. And so I think in response or how involved the police should be, I don't think it should be from a policing perspective. I think it should be more so from a community involvement perspective. And keeping in mind that when police arrive at a scene, they have a number of options in what they can do when they arrive there. They can speak with the family, they can choose to engage in community restoration tactics, they can do conflict de escalation. But I think the main and crucial issue is a lot of police officers lack the skills to do these things successfully. And I think a lot of the times when we talk about police force and police training, we focus it so much on these responsive measures that we forget that police are also meant to help the community and they're meant to be pillars of support in the community. And so I think with their involvement in mental health crises, they should be there to assist the people and the family. And so I think in regards to a prime case of this is with the incident in Toronto with Reggie Christiansky Paquette, where her family called the police in order to get help for her. And unfortunately, her life was taken away as she fell from a 20-foot building. And so, in that situation, I think it becomes more clear than ever that the police need to reevaluate their training, like Simran said, and take it away from a policing, quote unquote, perspective and move it more towards a restoration and de escalation perspective. I think it's so important to engage with the community. I think we don't talk a lot about community leaders and the importance of ethnic support. Seeing people who look like you really and truly makes a world of difference. And I think as a community, we underplay the importance of representation. So many times, in my experience and the experiences of others, when we talk about police, we see a white man, and that shouldn't be the case. We should be able to see the police force as an ethnically diverse experience. And I think the police, when they're engaging with these communities, should talk to community leaders, talk to ethnic individuals, talk to organizers, and see what exactly does the community I'm policing need. Do they need constant reminders of my presence, or do they need somebody who can be spoken to and somebody who can be engaged with? So I think it's not just about putting the police there and stationing them in these communities and saying, oh, look, we have police engaging with the community. It's, are the police genuinely getting to know the residents? Are the police coming out to the activities? Are the police going, I don't know, door to door and speaking with these individuals in order to get to know them on a human to human level? And I think once you start to develop those relationships, and it's not just about numbers or statistics or putting the police where they seem to be needed, it's about cultivating an environment where we see the police as friends and as community pillars. That's when I think change will actually ensue. I think when we talk about the strength behind the police force, we often see a lack in social workers, we see a lack in community organizers, we see a lack in justice for a lot of different communities and marginalized groups. And so we invest all this time and money into the wrong areas of policing. And I think a lot of the times, especially when we're talking about areas that are traditionally indigenous, people of color, areas that tend to be over policed, we see that the police don't necessarily do their job. I find in a lot of these cases, the police are given more power and more authority than they necessarily need to be effective. And so rather than just focusing on one area of justice, which is the police, we need to also diversify and we need to talk about, are there individuals, community organizers, social workers, CPS workers who are members of the BIPOC experience, who can speak to the LGBTQ experience? Can they speak to a neurodivergent experience? Because if you can't, it becomes extremely difficult to relate to the community that you're in. And therefore, I think that's what builds the gap in policing. And that's what makes it so difficult for police officers to be effective. And I don't think it's just a one on one conversation. It need not be police, then community. It can be police, social workers in the middle, guidance counselors in the middle, and then it can be the community. I think it should be a circle where communication is constantly ongoing and it's revolving around the people who they have sworn to protect. I have. Similar to Simran, we were both on the mock trial team together. And so we had our SROs who were really amazing. It was really a blessing to work with them, I would say. They were definitely a pillar of support. But I think that was more so because our SROs, they weren't there to police and they weren't there to arrest and they weren't there to serve justice. They were there to, I saw them really, and what they established themselves as were teachers. And they were there to coach and to help. We had one of our SROs was involved in sports, the other one was involved in like academic competitions. And so at first I was a little bit wary about, I didn't really understand what their purpose was, but seeing how they positioned themselves, not as police officers, not as, individuals coming to catch you or be hyper vigilant or militarize the school, but they genuinely just wanted our school to succeed in competitions or in games or in activities. And I think it made a world of difference. And so I don't want to use my SRO experience to speak on the entire SRO experience, but I do believe that if the program is refined, where it's not about putting police officers there to catch students or to prevent them from doing things that are inherently wrong, but rather show students what is possible when you interact with members of the community, I think that would be a million times more effective. I think there is potential in the
Mhm.
program, but I think the way it's set up currently doesn't allow us to tap into that potential, particularly after the report released by the Peel District School Board that detailed police officers, not sure if they were part of the SRO program or just generally, were coming into schools. And there was one incident where they arrested a girl who was in grade one. They arrested her, put her on her back, and handcuffed her, a girl who was in grade one. And so I think having the police in schools isn't necessarily a solution, nor is it necessarily or inherently the wrong thing, but it does, like myself and Simran have both talked about, it does lead to the militarization of schools that is extremely unnecessary. Coupled with existing issues such as streaming students away from academic programs, you find yourselves, or students of color find themselves, often in situations where they are faced with fear tactics, intimidation tactics. They are bullied and they find themselves where they have nowhere to turn to. The administration rarely, if ever, has individuals of color because there's not enough hiring practices that cater to that. And then they find the police who have not historically been friendly with people of color. And so you find yourself pushed against a wall where it seems as though, irrespective to where you turn, the only option is things like that are quite frankly not favorable, and you seem to never have a favorable position. And so I don't think it's necessarily that you have to have police officers there to build community relations. I think it's more so important to have community members there. Similarly to what Simran said, I don't think accountability starts with the camera. I think accountability starts with the system that is fundamentally broken. Police officers are given a large breadth and a lot of leeway in how they conduct investigations, in how they are held in the court of law. And so, in terms of accountability, I think the body cams are a step in the right direction if used effectively. Reports by CBC found a Department of Police in Montreal who purchased body cameras, but they had sat unused since 2017. And so I think a lot of times when issues like this occur, um, in general, the public has a habit, or even community organizers or authority has a habit of coming together and doing whatever they can very quickly to silence people and say, here, we gave you what you wanted. And what we want isn't just body cameras. We want to see long lasting and impactful change. And so I think it's not just refining whether or not we can see the actions of the police officers, it's how are they interacting? Because we don't know what happens before the cameras are turned on, and we don't know what happens after that. So I think the body cameras are just a small piece of the overall conversation about accountability. But there has to be audits, regulations, conversations that don't just focus on the majority and they don't just focus on the minority. They have to consider everyone equally. People who aren't considered in surveys, people who are traditionally marginalized and left behind, homeless populations, people of color who are more likely to be pulled over by the police. They all have to be discussed and their perspectives considered in this conversation. So, similar to what Simran said, I think privacy is a really big issue, especially as it intersects with mental health. I think if police are responding to a mental health crisis, I would want to know or understand how exactly they're going to use the body cameras in that situation, since those can be very personal, intimate moments for people who do suffer from mental illness. And they may not want to have that information on camera. But I would also want to consider, are we using the body cameras as a scapegoat to prevent ourselves from having those more difficult conversations? And I don't think the body cameras are the end all be all, nor do I think they're going to be the one technological device that unravels 400 years of systemic racism. But I would hope and I would really ask the police department to use the body cameras in a way that enables them to hold themselves accountable, to see where they go wrong, and to make changes accordingly.